Late on the night of June 30th, 1991, a silver Honda sat abandoned on the shoulder of southbound State Route 73 in Newport Beach, California. The hazard lights were blinking, the doors were unlocked, the battery was completely drained, but nobody was inside. The woman who owned that car was 23-year-old Denise Huber, and she had simply ceased to exist right there on the edge of a busy California highway, minutes from pulling into her own driveway. Police arrived, search dogs were dispatched. The K9 unit picked up her scent moving forward from the car, traced it for exactly 75 yards along the shoulder, and then the trail died completely. She had been loaded into another vehicle in the darkness, on a public road, with no one watching. And for the next 3 years, over 1,000 days, nobody knew what had happened to her or where she was. The answer, when it finally came, didn't arrive through surveillance footage or a breakthrough DNA hit or an anonymous tip to a hotline. It came from 2 retired strangers at an Arizona flea market who noticed something about a truck that just didn't sit right with them. They made one phone call. That call led investigators to a discovery that left an entire forensic team standing in stunned silence inside a rented cargo truck in the desert heat. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this are the reason you're here, hit subscribe. Every one of these cases deserves to be heard. To really understand what was taken that night, you have to understand who Denise Huber actually was. She was 23, had just finished her degree at UC Irvine in social sciences, and was doing what a lot of new graduates do, living back home with her parents, Dennis and Ione, and her younger brother Jeff in Newport Beach, while she worked 2 part-time jobs and saved up to get her own place. She waitressed at the old spaghetti factory, which is where she met her boyfriend Stephen Horrocks, who worked the bar there. She stood 5'9", had long dark brown hair, and by all accounts she was the kind of person who kept her word. If she was staying somewhere overnight, she'd call. If she was running late, she'd leave a message. She wasn't the type to just disappear without a word and leave the people who loved her sitting up wondering. On the night, everything changed. Denise drove over to pick up her co-worker Robert Calvert to go see Morrissey play at the Great Western Forum out in Inglewood. For Calvert, it was something more. He was hoping the night might turn into something romantic. For Denise, it was just a concert with a friend. Nothing heavy, nothing unusual. The show ended, and she drove Calvert back to his place around 2 in the morning. Then she turned her car south toward Newport Beach. She was close. She was almost home. And then the back right tire on her Honda Accord blew. She pulled over to the shoulder on SR 73, flipped on the hazard lights, and stepped out of the car. That was the last time anyone who loved her ever saw her alive. The following morning, the Huber family woke to an empty house. Denise's bed hadn't been slept in. At first, they told themselves the most reasonable thing. She must have stayed over at a friend's place after the show. It happened sometimes. But as the hours passed and there was no phone call, no message, no sign of her, the quiet worry in the house began to grow into something louder. They started calling her friends one by one. Nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her. That's when Denise's closest friend, Tammy Brown, got in her car and drove the route Denise normally took home. On SR 73, she found the Honda. Rear tire flat, hazard lights dead from a drained battery, doors unlocked, no blood, no broken glass, no note, just a car that had been sitting there for hours with nobody inside it. On the front seat there was a pair of pantyhose, something Denise always slipped off while she was driving, a small habit that everyone close to her knew. Her keys and her wallet were gone. Costa Mesa police were called immediately. Detective Ron Smith caught the case, and from the moment he pulled up to that shoulder on SR 73, something told him this was serious. He looked around and cataloged everything nearby. An emergency call box mounted right there on the guardrail. A public phone just a short walk away. A convenience store with its lights on, clearly visible from where the car was parked. Denise had access to help. She had resources within reach, and she hadn't used any of them. Helicopters swept the hills and brush surrounding the highway. A K9 unit tracked her scent forward from the driver's seat of the car. The dogs moved with purpose for exactly 75 yards and then stopped. The scent line just ended, snapped off like a wire cut clean. She had gotten into another vehicle at that point, or she had been put into one. When officers expanded the search perimeter, they found her shoes lying near the car, the heels she had worn to the concert the night before. Except the heels weren't heels anymore. The undersides had been ground completely down to raw plastic. The kind of damage that doesn't happen from walking on asphalt. That kind of wear happens when someone is dragged. There had been no witnesses. There were no cameras on that stretch of highway in 1991. No one had called to report anything strange. All investigators had was an abandoned car, a scent trail that stopped in the middle of nowhere, and a pair of shoes that told a quiet and terrible story. From that point forward, Detective Ron Smith and the Costa Mesa investigators ran a case that refused to let itself go cold even when every lead exhausted itself. The team made one standing rule. Every single day, someone had to do something active with Denise Huber's file. It didn't matter if it was reviewing an old interview transcript, re-examining photographs, or rereading a statement that had already been read a dozen times. The case stayed in motion. The first order of business was Robert Calvert. He was the last confirmed person who had been with Denise. He was brought in, walked investigators through the entire night from beginning to end, and submitted to a polygraph. He passed. He was cleared. Stephen Horrocks, her boyfriend who had originally planned to go to the concert but got stuck working, had an airtight alibi confirmed independently. He was cleared too. Investigators cast a wider net, friends, co-workers, anyone who had spent time around Denise. Nothing surfaced. No motive, no opportunity, no red flags. Because the crime, if there had been one, appeared to be the work of a complete stranger, someone who had simply been driving on SR 73 that night, spotted a disabled vehicle with a young woman standing alone beside it, and made a decision. That is the hardest kind of case to break. No relationship, no prior history, no obvious connection to follow. Thousands of tips flooded in over the following months, generated by media coverage and the relentless campaign the Huber family ran on their own. Dennis Huber covered his car in Denise's missing person posters and drove the streets of Newport Beach and Costa Mesa. The family put up a massive banner on the side of an apartment building overlooking the exact stretch of SR 73 where the Honda had been found, a giant photograph of their daughter and a phone number, facing the highway every hour of every day. Detective Smith maintained a close, ongoing relationship with the family throughout all of it. He met them for breakfast. He told them what he could. He made sure they knew that Denise's file was not buried under a stack of other cases, that someone was still turning it over every single morning. 3 years went by like that. In the spring of 1994, a man named John Joseph Famularo showed up in Prescott Valley, Arizona. He was 37 years old, had grown up in Santa Ana, and worked as a painting contractor in Orange County for years. By every surface measure, he was unremarkable, polite, well-spoken, the kind of person neighbors wouldn't think twice about. He told people in Arizona he was a contractor liquidating inventory, and he set up a booth at the local flea market selling painting supplies. He rented a house in Prescott Valley, and right next door to his rental, his mother moved in. He told her very little about why he needed her help. But one day, when his power was shut off, he ran an extension cord from her house to a large rented cargo truck that had been sitting in his driveway, weeds growing up around the tires, for weeks on end. He needed to keep a chest freezer in the back of that truck running continuously. His mother helped him. She had no idea what was inside. At the Prescott Valley Flea Market, Famularo crossed paths with a retired couple named Jack Court and Elaine Caniglia, who ran their own booth nearby. They became acquaintances over a few weeks of shared market days. In early July of 1994, Famularo invited them to his home to look at additional merchandise. They agreed and drove over. That's when Elaine Caniglia saw the truck. It was a 24-foot Ryder rental truck, still wearing California plates, sitting in the driveway under a tarp. Weeds had grown up through the gap between the tires and the pavement. An orange extension cord snaked from somewhere inside the house and disappeared under the cargo door of the truck. And the truck, according to Famularo, had been sitting there since before he arrived in Arizona months earlier. Something didn't add up to Caniglia. A man who had just relocated wouldn't still have a rental truck sitting in his driveway. And the extension cord, running power out to a truck nobody had moved or seemed to need, made her mind go somewhere uncomfortable. She'd heard about mobile meth labs discovered in unexpected places. She didn't say anything. She and Jack purchased a few items and left. But before she drove out of the street, she quietly wrote down the license plate number from the Ryder truck. She took that plate number to a friend of hers in law enforcement. She said something about the truck didn't look right. She couldn't explain exactly what it was. She just knew it didn't look right. On July 13, 1994, Investigators from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department arrived at the property on the basis of that tip. The plate on the truck came back quickly. It had been reported stolen out of California. A warrant was obtained. Officers suited up in protective gear, half expecting to find chemical residue from a drug operation when they pulled open the cargo door. What they found instead was a single chest freezer, sitting alone in the cargo hold, connected to an extension cord running back to the house. Nothing else. Lieutenant Scott Masher led the team to the freezer. The lid came up. Inside, large black plastic bags layered on top of one another. And at the bottom, visible through the gap beneath the bottom bag, was a dark frozen liquid, rust-colored, the consistency of old blood that had congealed and then frozen solid. Nobody jumped to conclusions. This was Arizona. Hunters stored elk and deer in chest freezers all the time. Masher began lifting the bags out one at a time. Then a hand appeared. Fingers the blue purpose of cold stopped circulation, rigid with frost. He kept lifting. An arm, a shoulder. And then the full form, a woman's body drawn into itself, hands cuffed tightly behind her back, every surface of her skin glazed with ice crystals. 3 separate layers of black plastic bags had been wrapped around her head. Masher described the moment later. Nothing about his training or his years on the job had prepared him for what was inside that freezer. It was, by any measure, one of the most horrifying crime scenes any of those investigators would encounter in their careers. Less than an hour after the discovery, John Joseph Famularo himself drove back to the property with his mother. He had no idea police were standing inside his truck. He was arrested on the spot, initially only for theft of the rental vehicle. At the station, he was cooperative and calm until investigators began asking about the freezer. Then he stopped, looked the detective across the table directly in the face, and said he had nothing more to say. Then he asked for a lawyer. The forensic process that followed was unlike anything the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's office had encountered before. Arizona is not a state where frozen bodies are a routine consideration. The forensic team had to use hair dryers to thaw the victim slowly and carefully, preserving fingerprints and trace evidence as the ice melted layer by layer. The process took the better part of 2 days before a full internal examination could begin. What the examination revealed was methodical brutality. The handcuffs had been cinched so tightly they had to be cut away with bolt cutters. There was no key and lock solution, no normal removal. Beneath the 3 layers of plastic wrapped around her head, the victim's eyes and mouth had been sealed shut with duct tape. A blood-soaked wad of cloth had been forced into her mouth. Degraded sperm cells were recovered from the rectal sample, confirming sexual assault had occurred before death. The cause of death was catastrophic blunt force trauma, 31 separate blows to the skull, hard enough and with enough concentrated force to shatter bone across multiple fracture lines. Forensic anthropologist Laura Fulginiti was brought in to reconstruct the skull from the fragments, a process she compared to assembling a 50-piece puzzle, where each piece had to be positioned correctly to understand the direction of each impact, the angle of force, and the type of object that had made it. Her reconstruction took 2 days. The damage patterns were consistent with a hammer and a crowbar. Both items were recovered from a box in Famularo's garage, labeled in marker on the outside. Christmas DNA testing confirmed the blood on the crowbar matched the victim's DNA. Identification came through fingerprints. A forensic technician lifted a thumbprint from the thawing body and ran it against a California driver's license found inside the same Christmas box. The match was exact. The name on that license was Denise Huber. Lieutenant Masher called the Costa Mesa Police Department. He told them he believed they might have their answer. Detective Ron Smith took the call. He later said he nearly came out of his chair when he heard the name. The search warrant served at Famularo's house the following day produced a scene that investigators described as overwhelming. Every room was packed from floor to ceiling, stacks of old newspapers going back decades, bills, books, cardboard boxes arranged in columns with narrow walkways barely wide enough for one person to pass through. Over 100,000 individual items were ultimately cataloged from the property. Among them, a key that matched the handcuffs removed from the victim's wrists. 2 complete Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department uniforms, badges and all, hanging carefully in a closet. Famularo had once attended the Reserve Academy training program for that department before washing out in the early weeks for failing to qualify. He had never returned the uniforms. He had kept them. In the garage, between hundreds of paint cans and construction equipment, investigators found 2 cardboard boxes side by side. Both had the word Christmas written on the outside. The first contained Denise's personal belongings, her purse, her checkbook, her credit cards, her driver's license. The second contained the murder weapons, women's clothing soaked in blood, the pair of heels with the ground-down soles, surgical gloves, an empty handcuff package, rolls of plastic bag, duct tape, and a blood-stained tarp. All of it had been neatly arranged, carefully preserved, kept intact for 3 years, and transported across a state line. Also scattered throughout the house, identification documents belonging to multiple other women, social security cards, driver's licenses, personal papers belonging to women investigators did not yet know. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property and alerted at multiple different spots across the grounds. Police dug. Nothing was found. But the question of whether Denise was the only victim never entirely went away. Investigators tracked every piece of identification recovered from the house and made contact with each woman. All of them were alive, except one, the woman from Costa Mesa, California, Denise Huber. Also in the house, numerous issues of the Orange County Register, clipped and saved, every one of them carrying coverage of Denise's disappearance. And a videotape, a recorded episode of Inside Edition that had aired a segment about the case. For 3 years, while the Huber family plastered the city with flyers and Detective Smith opened that file every single morning, Famularo had been sitting in his home reading every article and watching every broadcast about the search for the woman he had killed. He had followed it the way someone follows a story they wrote themselves, with total attention, complete possession, and the satisfaction of knowing something no one else could know. He kept the evidence like a collection. And that compulsion, that inability to let go of the objects and the story, became the thread that unraveled everything. John Joseph Famularo was born in 1957 on Long Island and had grown up in Santa Ana, California. At the time of the crime, he was 34 years old, working as a painting contractor across Orange County, a job that gave him access to homes, warehouses, and commercial properties throughout the area. People who knew him described him as personable and articulate. Nothing about him stood out in the way you might expect. He had tried to join the Los Angeles Sheriff's Reserve Program, the part-time volunteer pathway for people who wanted to work in law enforcement but washed out after a few weeks. He never gave back the uniforms. Once Denise's identity was confirmed and the blood evidence was cataloged, investigators turned to the central legal question: where did the crime actually happen? The answer determined jurisdiction, and California's criminal statutes carried more severe penalties than Arizona's in this instance. Investigators traced Famularo's footprint in Southern California and discovered that he had rented a storage unit in Laguna Hills, 12 miles from the spot on SR 73, where Denise's car had been found. He had used the unit to store painting supplies and had cleared it out in August 1992, 13 months after Denise vanished. A search warrant was obtained. Investigators entered with luminol, the chemical reagent that fluoresces when it contacts hemoglobin, even traces cleaned and dried and sitting undisturbed for years. They went inch by inch across every surface in that storage unit. At the very end of the search, in the last corner they hadn't yet covered, they sprayed what was left of their luminol. The wall glowed. DNA extracted from the biological material at the California storage unit matched Denise Huber's DNA profile perfectly. The crime had occurred in California. Jurisdiction was California, and now investigators could build the sequence. Famularo had been driving SR 73 late that night, trolling. He spotted Denise's disabled Honda on the shoulder with its hazard lights cycling in the dark. Police believe he may have been wearing the LA Sheriff's uniform when he stopped. A woman standing alone beside a broken car at 2 in the morning would have no reason to distrust a law enforcement officer. He took her to the Laguna Hills storage unit. He sexually assaulted her. He beat her to death with tools he had brought with him. He placed her body in the freezer. He locked the unit and drove away. He continued working in Orange County for over a year afterward, reading every newspaper story about the missing woman, before moving his operation to Arizona and taking the freezer with him. He never confessed. He never explained. The evidence did all of that for him. When investigators arrived in Arizona, they discovered that Famularo had been actively digging a basement beneath his rental home, a project he had not disclosed to his landlord. The theory that emerged from that finding was straightforward. He intended to bury Denise's body, along with the freezer and all of the evidence inside it, beneath the floor of the house and seal it in concrete. If the basement had been finished before Elaine Caniglia made her phone call, Denise Huber would never have been found. Her case would have remained open forever. Famularo was extradited to California after being formally charged. He pleaded not guilty across the board, despite a prosecution case built around the victim's body, confirmed DNA, the murder weapons with the victim's blood still embedded in the metal, preserved physical evidence spanning 2 states, and 3 years' worth of trophy keeping that told its own story about who he was. The trial opened in Orange County Superior Court in May 1997. Prosecutors walked the jury through the full architecture of the crime, the premeditation evident in the 3 layers of plastic bags wrapped around Denise's head before the beating began, the careful preservation of the body, the meticulous hoarding of evidence that served no purpose except to allow him to revisit what he had done. The California Supreme Court would later note in its written record that the act of concealing the body in a freezer demonstrated conscious effort to suppress evidence of the sexual assault and the binding of the victim, and that placing multiple layers of plastic over her head before the killing was a detail that supported a finding of deliberation and premeditation. Detective Ron Smith testified about the forensic chain, how blood evidence placed the crime in California, how the DNA matched, how the physical evidence recovered from the Christmas boxes connected directly to the body in the freezer and the blood at the storage unit. The defense leaned on Famularo's psychological history and a claimed background of childhood trauma, attempting to position the evidence in a frame that might soften the sentence. They sought to introduce testimony from Famularo's brother about alleged childhood abuse. The court ruled that testimony inadmissible as hearsay. It went no further. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty of first-degree murder, 2 special circumstances, murder in the course of a kidnapping, and murder during the commission or attempted commission of sodomy. The sentencing that followed, death to be carried out at San Quentin State Prison. Famularo filed multiple appeals in the years that followed, challenging jury selection procedures, media coverage, and various aspects of the trial's conduct. In 2011, the California Supreme Court issued its ruling after a full review. The conviction and the death sentence were upheld. The evidence had been overwhelming. The trial had been fair. As of 2026, John Joseph Famularo is still alive. He is in his late 60s. He remains on California's death row at San Quentin under the state's ongoing moratorium on executions, a moratorium that has no defined endpoint. Ione Huber, reflecting on that reality, said what only a parent in her position could say, that at their age, he would almost certainly outlive them. Dennis Huber said that when Detective Smith called him in July 1994 to tell him what had been found in Arizona, the world as he had constructed it over 23 years of raising his daughter simply ended. It wasn't that he was unprepared for the worst. 3 years of searching with no answers had made him and Ione both live inside that possibility every single day. What broke him was the specificity. When the details of Denise's last hours came through, those details never left him. There are 2 things this case leaves behind that are worth sitting with. The first is about highway breakdowns. It can happen to anyone. A tire gives out, you pull over, it's the middle of the night. The instinct is to get out of the car and deal with it. Don't. Stay inside. Lock the doors. Use your phone to call for help or to contact roadside assistance. When Denise's car lost its tire on SR 73, there was an emergency call box on the guardrail nearby, a public telephone within reach, and an open convenience store visible in the distance. None of those resources required her to stand alone on a dark highway shoulder. Today, with a phone in your pocket, there is no reason at all to step outside and wait in the open. Call first. Wait in the car. Let the help come to you. The second is about Elaine Caniglia. She didn't know what was in that freezer. She couldn't have. She just saw a truck that had no reason to be where it was, with an extension cord running to it from a house and a license plate from a state the man had supposedly left behind. She felt something was wrong. She couldn't prove it, and she didn't try to. She wrote down a plate number and called someone she trusted. That single act, that one quiet decision to trust her own discomfort and make a phone call, is the entire reason Denise Huber was ever found. It is the reason her family was able to bury her and sit in a courtroom and watch a verdict come back. One phone call. That is all it cost. If something looks wrong, say something. You don't need certainty. You don't need to be able to name exactly what's bothering you. The people who are paid to investigate those feelings have all the tools to determine whether you're right. Your job is just to make the call. If Denise's story stayed with you, please subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Every one of them matters. Every one of them deserves to be told. Thank you for watching.